represented on the panel today. Before we start on our conversation about what's happening in the educational publishing market, we will hear a few words from the sponsor of this award, Tim Davis of Westchester Education Services. So Tim, tell us about Westchester, how you've adapted through the crisis and how you can help publishers during this recovery period.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everyone. Don't worry, I won't speak for too long. I won't hold up the webinar for longer than necessary. I'm Tim Davis. I'm UK Managing Director of Westchester Publishing Services and Westchester Education Services. I hope you're all well and you've been coping okay under recent extremely challenging circumstances. For those of you who don't know Westchester, I'll tell you briefly a little bit about us, who we are and what we do. So Westchester is employee owned and we've been trading for more than 50 years. We provide a full range of pre-press services to our academic, educational and professional publisher clients, including content creation, copy editing, typesetting, design, digital production and project management. We have more than 200 clients in the UK, Europe, US and around the world, including UCL Press, Edinburgh University Press, Yale and Harvard University Presses, Bloomsbury, Macmillan, Edward Elgar, Gill Education in Ireland, and many, many more. Our UK office is in Stratford-upon-Avon. Our head office is in Connecticut. Our Educational Services Division is based in Ohio, and we have 2 operations in India, one in Chennai and one in Noida, New Delhi. I'm very happy to report that our international teams are all safe and healthy, and like the vast majority of our industry, we implemented our working from home plans for both our US and India teams very quickly after the scale of the crisis became clear. This transition was aided by our client portal project management platform, Dropbox, Zoom, and other tools. Both Westchester Publishing Services and Westchester Education Services can be very valuable partners to academic, educational, and professional publishers in the current crisis and beyond. Many of our academic and professional clients have told us that they're reviewing and adjusting their new title programs as a result of the closure of bookshops, universities, and colleges in the UK and worldwide. As part of those reviews, some titles have been cancelled, rescheduled, and/or outsourced to pre-press vendors like Westchester in order to balance in-house pre-press teams' workloads. Similarly, many of our educational and ELT clients have looked to us for added content development or production capacity, or to assist in creating revision or assessment resources, or to move into new markets, globalize existing content, or adapt and revise backlist material. In short, whatever your pre-press needs, Westchester can help you. So we're delighted to sponsor this year's award for the 2nd time running, and I'd like to congratulate both my friends at the Bookseller for the fantastic job they've done in organising yesterday's awards ceremony and today's webinar. And of course, I'd like to congratulate Jessica Kingsley Publishers on their well-deserved win, along with all the shortlisted publishers. The standard of entries was again exceptional. And thank you very much and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Tim, for joining us, and thank you for sponsoring the award.
Pleasure.
So a few housekeeping points. My name is Emma House and I'm going to be chairing this panel today. We're going to be running until 3:30 p.m, which will include time for questions. The questions will be moderated by the Bookseller team, so please submit any that you have at any point in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and please select all panelists and attendees. If you have any panelists to which you want to direct your question, just name them in the chat as well. Also, just use the chat function to say hello to your colleagues. If you need to communicate with the Bookseller team for any reason, please use the chat to send a message to Emma Lowe. I'd now like to introduce our panel. So on my screen next to me that I can see, I've got Caroline Wright, who is Director General at the Trade Association BESA. We've then got Amy Lankester-Owen, who is Senior Commissioning Editor at Jessica Kingsley Publishing.
Hi.
We've got Lee Newman, who is Publisher of Education at Collins Learning at HarperCollins. And then unfortunately, we can't see her on the screen today. She's had a technical hitch, but we've got Jane Harley, Policy and Partnerships Director for Education at Oxford University Press.
Hello.
Hi, Jane.
Hi.
So the COVID-19 virus and lockdowns had a major impact on schools, teachers and learners, not only here in the UK, but across the world. And certainly those parents out there will know that it's also had a big impact on parents and carers of children. Here in the UK, exams were cancelled and everyone had to quickly adapt to remote learning and teaching. And this has happened in a variety of ways, at variety in speeds and varying qualities. So today we'd just like to explore this in more depth and detail, and also hear about how publishers have responded to that challenge and what will happen next as we emerge from the crisis and schools start to go back mainly in September. So firstly, I'd like to ask our panelists how you feel the last 14 weeks have gone in general for schools, teachers and learners. And we'll start with Caroline.
Thank you. Well, I mean, massive congratulations and thank you to the teachers for stepping up to the challenge of helping us all home educate. So I think schools have really adapted very, very well given the situation. I think from an educational provider's point of view, and speaking for the companies that BESA works with, I think actually UK companies had a bit of a head start on schools. Obviously, British curriculum publishers work with thousands of schools across the world, helping them deliver their curriculums. So all the way from the start, from Hong Kong, China and the wider ASEAN region, as soon as those schools started to close when COVID started, our companies have been working with them and learning and adapting what works well, and being able to actually, by the time it's crossed the world and got to the UK and then further on, they've been very, very well placed to actually work side by side with schools and say, well, do you know what we found worked well for our schools in X region? And so I think we've learned as those sort of 3 or 4 months have gone past. So I think that's been very helpful to that degree that anything can be helpful during coronavirus. But I think the second key way that UK providers have really been adapting, and it's something that I feel very proud of working with all of our member companies, is ever since day one, vast majority of educational providers have been making available lots and lots and lots of their content, lots and lots of their services, making it available free of charge to help support schools in the UK and internationally during the crisis. And we did a quick piece of work just to look at what that really meant. And we estimate that it's around £30 million just since the end of February. So over just into the beginning of June. So just over a 3-month period, that actually represents from our BESA members' turnovers about 3% of the annual turnover. And that's really significant given we're in a very challenging economic time anyway. So I think it's fantastic the way that the educational publishers industry has really stepped up to support schools when they're most in need.
Great. And Lee, what's your impression of the last 14 weeks and how it's gone? I imagine you've been really busy yourself.
Yeah, I mean, as Caroline said, I think a massive amount of appreciation and kudos to teachers and parents and children as well, who can rightly feel a sense of pride and accomplishment at what they've achieved over the last 15 or 16 weeks. And I think to look at the positives, if you can see the positives in this situation, it is around how the sector has pulled together. Very much as Caroline said, there's a real sense, a collegiate sense of working together with our fellow publishers, making content available to schools and to parents for free to support them through the crisis. So I think that's been one real positive of the crisis.
And Jane, although we can't see you, we can hear you. What's been your impression of the lockdown period and the reaction to the pandemic?
Well, I think everything Caroline and Lee have said, I would absolutely endorse. I think what has been amazing is how schools have actually managed to reimagine and reinvent education in the past 14 weeks. And they've done that by simply taking on the kind of enormous challenges of moving school into the home, moving connections and building connections with parents, suddenly taking on becoming a sort of social hub and administering free school meals or cooking in the kitchens, distributing digital, it really has put teaching and the school, I think, back into the heart of the community in a way, and raised the profile and the sort of status of teaching. And you wouldn't expect necessarily a pandemic to bring these results, but I think teachers have so risen to the challenges, and although obviously there are many challenges, and I think they've worked tirelessly to overcome them, and we have worked tirelessly to support them, it is an opportunity for teaching to be re-establish its status as, you know, such a central piece of the whole. I mean, it obviously is at the heart of education. I think in terms of pupils, it's also been a really mixed picture. So there are some pupils who I think actually will have potentially thrived almost by having the ability to direct their own education and almost find a way through it on their own. Obviously, the much more worrying part are the many children who are going to have had practically no schooling for the last 14 weeks, and clearly that is an enormous challenge going forward. So I think it's been 14 weeks of kind of getting used to managing remote learning, and now I think we face the next challenges of how to get back into schools again and manage that sort of hybrid learning, which will be the next big area of focus.
And Amy, JKP doesn't publish for the curriculum, but you publish a range of titles that support teachers, especially with niche areas. What's been your impression of how teachers have coped over the last 14 weeks?
I think it's been absolutely huge, the whole thing, just the fact that schools are closed. I mean, so often when there's a crisis, schools stay open, and they're the sort of piece of consistency we all have. So I think echo everyone else's sentiments that we owe teachers a lot, and schools have sort of stayed at the heart of the community while being predominantly shut. I think for us, it's also about the learners. And thinking about the learners, I would very much echo what Jane was just saying about how there's a big variety in how kids have responded to this. And I think the hardest hit are those who are already the most disadvantaged, socially and economically. And I know that some of them haven't even been getting into school, even though in theory schools are open to them, because they've got the hardest to reach parents who've also got their own difficulties. Or if the children have additional needs, like special educational needs. So those are the communities and the niches that JKP supports. And what we've seen is that for SEN kids, we've sort of had more parents reaching out to us because of this hybrid model in a way. I think a parent with a child with dyslexia or autism who's suddenly responsible for their education maybe realises how much the schools are doing, and there's a bit of a sort of penny dropping moment when they have to realise how their child learns. So we've seen an increase in demand for our books of, say, activities for children with dyslexia to support their learning in a very bespoke way, maybe multisensory and stuff. And we've also seen an increase in sales of our books on anxiety, which are directed at teachers and parents, and on mental health stuff. And we've got a really strong core list that we've been able to that's tailored to those communities already. So I think that's worked well. It's just shifted slightly in terms of what's been picked up and what's been supporting.
And who it's been picked up by, I guess. Yeah. Like you say, it's not just teachers that are picking it up, it's parents now that those books were targeted at the educators, but now the parents are the educators.
The barriers are breaking down a bit.
Yeah, and Lee, obviously we can see how teachers have had to adapt to presenting classes technologically and through different methods, but when they're reaching out to you, what kind of things are teachers asking you for specifically? And have you seen an increase in contact from teachers?
I think for us it has mostly been about making resources available digitally that were in print previously, and being able to access them and to use them as they need to in their platforms. And I think and the speed of turning those requests around as well. They need things very quickly. They're working, at speed to put in place plans for children. And I think also, there's a massive logistical challenge in keeping schools running safely for key workers and vulnerable children, and now the year groups that have gone back, while supporting remote learning at home for the students who are still at home. Because I know they don't have to support the children home. They've been told that they should focus on the children in school, but for staff, they don't want any of their cohort left behind, and they're trying to keep all of the children moving forward at the same pace. And there are just so many inherent challenges on that. And I think actually on top of the logistical challenges, there's also the relationship management of, you know, managing their own staff who have their own personal circumstances or health concerns, and parents as well. So I think the schools that we've been speaking to are doing a lot of parental support as well. And as we've said previously, schools being a kind of community touch point, I've seen lots of questions going into head teachers that are really about a pandemic related, not really to do with learning or school at all. And I think people are looking for that sense of authority that they trust. So I think, again, I mean, trying to look at some positives. If there is more faith in teachers and schools as those positions of authority that we can trust, I think that'll be a long benefit of this.
And Jane, how has it been at OUP in terms of, have you seen an increase in contact from teachers? What kind of things are they asking you for? How do you feel they've had to adapt?
I mean, I think teachers have definitely reached out to publishers, and I think we're all doing everything we possibly can to support them. I think particularly around areas like, you know, how to get the best out of the digital resources that they have. So obviously many of our programs are blended, but getting those digital resources, and so we've put in a huge amount of support around actually effective implementation, and we do a lot of data monitoring to see how things are being used, and can go back into schools to support them to make sure that they're getting the very best out of what they've invested in or got free access to, because obviously during the summer term we've given many of our subscription products away free for schools. I think additionally we've, I mean, obviously the whole anxiety and pressure has had a huge bearing on everybody's lives, but I think for teachers it's been massive. And so we've run quite a number of webinars around well-being. And I guess in the past one might feel, you know, you get 100 people on a webinar. I think for some of our recent webinars we've had as many as 15,000 register.
Wow.
And you know, this just reflects the level of anxiety, but also actually importantly the need to kind of look after yourself in the context of all of this. I think the other area, I mean, as Lee said, kind of creating more digital, certainly more ebooks, and because we have a home website, Oxford Alpha Home, there is a lot of support for parents. So again, how to furnish more support for schools to be able to kind of recommend to parents, and for parents to be able to reach out to and advice. And with things like BBC, we've also done a lot of mirroring of the bite-sized support so that we can provide support for parents. So those are just some of the things where we've tried to help teachers as they adapt.
Yeah. Amy, have you got any further insights from your perspective on how teachers have been adapting?
Not a lot to add to that. Agree with all of that, really. Just to say that we very much uphold the view that teachers' mental health is really important too, anyway and at all times, but especially during COVID. And our resources on self-care and mental health for teachers have also been something that's been taken up more.
And Caroline, anything from your members that you want to add on how teachers are reaching out to suppliers for assistance?
Yeah, well, I very much agree with all of the well-being points, absolutely, and teachers as authority figures. We carried out a survey of schools, I think 700 schools, 400 primaries, 300 secondaries during April and May, so quite early on. And the focus was more on educational technology. So obviously their results are biased towards that. But they talked about the areas where they need help and support on from publishers and providers, being teacher training. There was a little bit about the management information systems they use and their learning environments and platforms. Then it was very much about the curriculum content, wanting support and help and knowing what to use. And then, you know, the one we'd all know about, funding. the challenges they face in terms of school funding. So I think I'm sure we'll come on to lots of those points, but I think the teacher training one is because they're adapting massively. They're doing things that might normally be outside of their comfort zone, and they're doing them admirably. But I think when things do return to more like a normal operating procedure, if you like, I think it's what can we do to help support them and embed that learning and move on from it, to help make them feel more comfortable outside of a crisis in using those kinds of technologies and tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that whole well-being thing is so important and is often overlooked or understated. So it's great to hear that that's been a priority. And we've touched briefly on the impact on learners, and especially with you, Amy, where you're talking about learners with special educational needs. And there's been a huge swathe of learners that are what we might call digitally excluded, where they don't have access to high-speed internet or don't have access to a computer and still can't get into school. I mean, what do you think the impact is going to be on learners? And do you think that we'll see a gap in attainment by the time children fully go back in September?
Yeah, I have to say, I do think we will. I think the gap between the advantaged and disadvantaged in society will probably increase. I think a lot of people think that, and there'll be certain children who suffer more. It's not just the loss of the formal education they're getting curriculum-wise, it's the loss of the security and the safe space that the school may have provided with some children, and sometimes it's the loss of actual safeguarding in the most extreme cases where social workers have to step in. And I think for SEN kids, they've lost out on their interventions, and say if they're autistic, they've lost out on the sort of social contact that they maybe find hard to, well, we've all lost out on social contact, but they've especially lost out on the learning they get around that in schools, which is quite a big deal. But I think one thing to bear in mind, again, coming back to mental health, is that for all children, this has really impacted learners' mental health and well-being. And that needs to come first. When I'm one of the people who believes that does need to come first when they go back to school. Because kids can't learn if they're stressed or unhappy. And that's what current psychology tells us. You know, it doesn't matter about the maths and the literacy. If they, first of all, they have to feel okay in themselves and feel safe and secure. So that's one of the things that JKP very much addresses in our books for kids, which are picked up by teachers. But within SEN, I think there are some positives too. And I think there are some positives for some children and learners, because actually we're hearing that they quite like being able to pace their own learning. They like using online resources and being at home and not having to not keep up with what's going on because of their reading issues or because of their executive function or working memory. So we've had an author, Margaret Rook, who worked with some dyslexic teenagers to talk about their experience, and a lot of it was actually very positive. So hopefully some of that will then feed back into how educational provision works for those kids, and they'll be more able to self-advocate and say, you know what, it really worked for us when we were doing it like that, and things will get a bit more fluid. So there could be some real advantages for SEN kids. But I do think there'll be a gap. So yeah.
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 And Lee, what's your impression? What are you hearing from the market about learners and the impact on them? And especially, I think, picking up on that point around the blended learning moving forward.
I mean, yeah, really to add to agree with Amy's comments, I think that unfortunately that gap has been widened. Both the regional gap and the socioeconomic gap will be widened by lockdown, unfortunately. And I think I would imagine that teachers will use the pandemic as a kind of as a levelling starting point to look at how a class have been disadvantaged, because some it will have been, you know, access to the internet. Others it might have been they might have suffered a loss of confidence. They might have had all the tools at their disposal but haven't been able to kind of work in that the slightly more self-directed way that they need to work. I think there's also an opportunity, as Amy said, to draw on the positives and think, what did people enjoy during lockdown? I mean, certainly I think the focus on non-core subjects is coming through. So we you know, PE with Joe, draw with Rob, those kinds of activities, I think that can sometimes get squeezed out in a busy curriculum when there are so many kind of targets to meet. I think that there'll be renewed interest in those areas that children really enjoy, and hopefully a bit more of a focus on the non-core.
Yeah. Jane, anything to add?
No, I mean, I think that there are quite a number of studies that have come out into the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the Institute of Education, really showing that, I think it was the Institute of Education, children locked down at home in the UK spend an average of 2.5 days a week doing schoolwork. And I think if you look at that and think about those that probably are spending quite a bit more because they have all the parental support, it really shows you that there are some children who are losing out in a big way. But I think to Lee's point, when they go back to school, I think there is a challenge that children also need. Firstly, they need to be feel comfortable and get back into, you know, getting used to the new structures, the bubbles they're going to be working with, potentially completely different teacher. That will take some time. And then I think there is a big question around what are the really important interventions and which bits do need catching up, but also actually how not to spend all your time catching up so that you then lose the next 6 months. So I think it's going to mean a huge amount of rethinking around what are the essential bits that do need teaching and do need catching up on, and how best to kind of structure all of that through good interventions or maybe some of the tutoring, but also to almost step back and say, what are the really important things in the curriculum, and how do we, to Lee's point, hold on to some of the good things about the breadth, but also what are the core areas without having to go in and do everything, because that will be impossible. And so yeah, and hopefully then start to close the gap. But the gap between the most able and the least able, I think, will be wider than it's ever been before. Anything to add on that, Caroline?
Not really. I think it's been covered. I'd absolutely agree with everything everyone said.
And there's been a really interesting question come in actually saying, if there are learning gaps, how are publishers able to help teachers identify these gaps for individual children and then fill them? And there's a question added on about is there an assumption that the government tutoring investment will be the main way to help with this process? Lee, do you want to come in on that?
I think initially it feels like there will be a very really diverse range of needs in any class or in any school. But I think over time, as I think as Caroline was suggesting, or Amy was suggesting, sorry, it's about looking at what the fundamentals that need to be covered and what needs to be caught up on. And I think those needs can start to be kind of arranged into groups, and then I think teachers and publishers can work together to look at the best resources to help them answer some of those needs. And I think that's something that publishers are really adept at doing. It's what we do, and I think that if anything during lockdown, we've certainly found we feel very close to the market. We're having, you know, very good conversations with teachers, and it is resulting kind of quite rapid thinking about how our products might meet teachers' needs. So I think it's just about us continuing that dialogue with teachers throughout the summer and into the autumn term, and looking at how best we can support them. But yes, looking at, and there's another question there about creating resources specifically to support those children who've lost out. There's definitely a role for publishers to play in quickly producing resources, market testing them, quality assuring them, and then sharing them more widely.
Could I just add to that? That point out is there the assumption that the tutoring investment will be the main way to help. I'd absolutely agree with Lee that it's wider than that. It's all of the resources that publishers have got. But just to put it into context, the tutoring scheme is £350 million. The other part of the 1 billion, the £650 million, if you put that on the basis of 8.2 million children in the UK, that equates to £80 per child per year, when the LSE have carried out research that estimates the amount that will be needed to help make up for the loss in learning is £1,350 per pupil per month. So the fact that they think a little bit of tutoring, I'm sure every little bit, you know, to Tesco's, every little bit helps, but there's so much more needed. And I think what publishers can do, but there is still a need for more investment. And I think that's where we need government to actually, that £650 million will schools have already got shortfalls. It will still only take it to less than the 2010 education spend in schools. So more money is needed for curriculum resources to help pupils and to help schools to catch up.
Can I just add as well, I think what is really important is that teachers will know their children and will know and be able to identify what their actual needs are. And in a sense, different children will have different needs. There isn't a one size fits all. So actually what is really important about the 650 million is that we'll go to teachers to decide. And I think if a tutor is the appropriate thing, they'll bring a tutor in, but actually some children will need a really powerful research-based intervention, and that will be where the money should be spent. So I do think that education publishers need to listen very carefully to teachers. I think that powerful interventions are often ones that have been developed over a considerable amount of time, and there are a number of very good ones out there. I think what one also needs to be aware of are the things that are kind of created in a few months. And that's not to say we aren't responding, but in terms of the sort of intervention area, these are things that you really want to make sure that the money invested is going into resources that are kind of proven and have the thought, rather than, I think there will be a great mass of support suddenly appearing from all quarters, and it's really important that teachers look carefully at what they're investing in and look at the evidence behind them.
Yeah. And do you think, Jane or Amy, do you think there will be some resources that specifically need to be created to support the children that have lost out?
I think there will, but I mean, from the JKP perspective, I'd say what we've been working on sort of consistently is at the edges of the curriculum, supporting SEN kids and looking at how they think and how neurodiverse thinking works, and kind of tailoring resources to that. So what I hope is that with the barriers breaking down a bit, and with a bit more of an individualized child-led approach, which may be necessitated by these gaps, which will mean that there's a much more sort of, much more varied classroom, then with the intervention, some of our resources which really look at how can a dyslexic child learn punctuation better, or how can they get a hang on things like spellings and the fundamentals, will come in and be really useful just already. So hopefully that those things will be useful for parents, tutors and teachers. That's the way we see it, rather than sort of, but I think there's loads that we can all do together to support teachers to find those gaps in the curriculum. And
absolutely. And we've already touched on how publishers have responded to supporting teachers and learners. And we've seen things like the wellness webinars, we've seen greater access to digital materials. Are there any other ways that you'd like to highlight that publishers have responded to this? And I'd imagine that's taken a huge amount of investment as well. Lee, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think we've made vast swathes of our content free, as we've touched on before. You know, our ebooks, resources. We've also cleared permissions, given permission for authors to read their books on YouTube. Anything that's going to engage children and provide teachers with support. But I think we've also been really mindful about how much content we put out and how many messages we send out to the market. Being mindful of not wanting to displace anything that teachers are already using that's already working for them. In that sense of, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And actually being mindful with parents as well, when as a publisher, when you're kind of recommending resources or tools, that you're not displacing what people have managed to put in place. I think that's quite important as well. I think that in a sense the sector is in quite a fragile state, and I think we need to think about teachers' well-being. And it's not about every single publisher shouting about that their resources are the ones to go to. I think so we have borne that in mind, I think, in our messaging, and it's very much a kind of collective industry response, I'd say, rather than individual publishers, which I think has been very positive.
And Amy, you mentioned on another initiative that JKP have been involved in terms of reading aloud.
Yeah, we've been actually from our American office and from here, we've been offering to teachers to sign up to like online versions of our books, which they can read aloud with children online, reaching teachers in different ways in that way. Our children's books actually are very popular with teachers, which cover some of our areas like, say, mental health and well-being or gender identity, because I guess those are the things that other publishers in education aren't necessarily doing, but which are really important in supporting children's well-being more broadly, as well as the neurodiversity books. So yeah, whether they'd want to read them out with the class on Zoom or something, or whether they'd actually do it in the classroom.
And Caroline, it must have been a great time for EdTech providers. I know BESA represents EdTech providers as well as publishers. How have they seen things change during the pandemic?
Well, I think much like print publishers, they've been making available a lot of their resources free of charge too. So, and again, much like the print publishers, as well as making available their products and services rightly free of charge where they can, they've seen a massive uptick in demand. So I think that I've heard several times, so this is anecdotal, but it seems to be most companies are mentioning around 7 times the normal traffic on their platforms, 7 times the amount of, you know, normal emails from school to parents, 7 times the normal amount of downloads. And so whilst they're doing the right thing and trying to help very much, they're also having additional costs with no revenue coming in, because they're actually taking on more people to handle the traffic and to help support schools during kind of a really, really important period. So it is getting to be a very difficult time, and it will be a difficult time for providers as they move forward, because clearly they haven't had revenue for the first, you know, 4 months, last 4 months, and they're needing to carry on supporting schools at a really important time. There was an interesting Office of Budgetary Responsibility report about 6 weeks ago now, that at the time I couldn't quite believe, but I do believe it now, that estimated that actually the education sector would be the single hardest hit part of the economy, even hit greater even than tourism and hospitality. And we are seeing a big challenge in terms of that coming to a head, as publishers and digital providers need to carry on innovating, need to carry on supporting schools, but we're having an extended period of school closures. So there's lots of challenges coming up for the sector. You're on mute, Emma.
There's a question there about, are we going to see EdTech players providing a stronger competitive threat as demand for digital and blended solutions increases? Jane, I don't know if you want to come in on that one.
I mean, there's no doubt that there will be many EdTech providers offering different services to schools, and I think that may open up a stronger competition. I think what is always important is also the quality of the content, and so that combination of sort of what you can do digitally and how that can support the delivery and the insight into how the content is used, plus the kind of deep content. I think that will come from a whole range of providers, and in a sense what we want is schools to be able to have maximum choice, and then to know that what they're buying is something that is of good quality and going to really help them. And we know that massive issues for teachers have been workload and really being able to kind of support them in their teaching. And so any EdTech publishing, or publishing from traditional publishers, as it were, who are also very strongly digital publishers, I think is a benefit to schools to have that choice.
Anything to add there, Lee?
No, I agree with Jane. Did you want me to add on we've had a question about the foundation subjects?
Yeah,
Yeah, so somebody asked about the importance of foundation subjects. It's worrying that leaks of the DfE school opening plan suggest some subjects might need to be suspended for 2 terms to catch up on core subjects. I think there needs to be recognition that the impact is, as we've covered before, is not just about learning loss, it's about lots of other things. And I hope that schools will be given a period and some space and some time to re-engage with children and work through that kind of healing process, and they should do that with whichever kind of subjects that they feel are the best route to that, the best vehicle for that, in terms of that process of re-engagement with learning, and be that, you know, music, PE, art, any subject really. I hope that they're given the space to be able to work that through in the content that's right for their own context. So I hope it doesn't have an impact that on foundation subjects that was suggested there.
Anything else to add, Amy or Caroline, on that? So either on competition from EdTech or on foundation subjects.
In terms of the sort of foundation subjects and the curriculum and stuff, I suppose I'm a bit of an optimist, I think the curriculum since September 2014 has been really difficult for SEN kids, like really full on. Some of the changing emphasis on memorizing stuff, the way they pack the curriculum, the grammar and spelling at primary. So I kind of secretly hope, probably really unrealistically, that there might actually be some long-lasting change that comes out of this, and that things might shift back towards the kind of subjects Lee's just been talking about, and to a much more balanced curriculum. But obviously I'm probably very naive and it won't change at all. But that would be my hope. And
actually Ofsted is currently now focused on a broad, rich, balanced curriculum, and so actually that I think still needs to be taken in mind. And yeah, so you're right, that breadth and balance is important.
I think from speaking as a parent, I would be horrified if the focus was just on English and maths, which, as important as they are, you know, the poor kids have been locked up. They haven't been out and exercising and playing football with their friends. They haven't gone on, if they're fortunate enough to go on holidays, they haven't been able to go on them. I think actually everyone's been stuck in their homes. So expanding their minds with an interesting curriculum to keep them and get them engaged, re-engaged in learning would be really important. I suppose I'd just like to add that point about competition, EdTech versus print. I think that's been going on. There is no want of healthy competition within our publishing, whether that's digital or print market. I think for me the most worrying new change to the system is competition from Her Majesty's government in giving funds and grant funding to non-commercial providers during COVID. I think that's the new challenge we face, rather than commercial providers, whether they're digital or print, fighting out amongst themselves.
That was going to be my next question, Caroline, because obviously publishers and EdTech providers aren't the only players in this market, and the government has a huge role to play in this. And we are seeing initiatives from institutions like BBC with Bite-Sized and Oak National Academy. Jane, why don't you talk us through a little bit about these initiatives and the impact that that's having on publishers?
Well, I think in the first instance and in the short term, both the BBC and Oak were faced with the same challenge that everybody was faced, and they stepped up to the plate, and they have in many ways supported parents and teachers. I think what makes it more of a threat looking forward is the substantial amount of funding that has gone into particularly Oak National Academy, and the promotion really of that as the route to support teaching. And I think, again, we have to think that those lessons will pull together very, very quickly. There are other routes through to deliver the curriculum through existing resources that are available, or through programs that are being developed. At the end of the day, if you give everything away free, the reality is that those businesses that rely on revenue to reinvest into the development of new innovative resources that will respond to teacher needs clearly are not going to, particularly at a time where funding is so tight, perhaps be as attractive to some teachers as a completely free offer. And I think therefore it becomes seriously worrying that the market is sort of undermined by an offer that seems to be promoted over many others. So I think Oak and BBC both had their place in the summer. I think looking forward, we need to revert back to the breadth of offer and the choice that's available. And I think the playing field needs to be a level one.
Anything to add, Caroline?
No, I think I'd agree with everything that Jane said on that, and it's not about it's not to criticise the offer that Oak and the BBC have offered. They've been offering some really, really good content, and actually the BBC's been partnering. I think more than 100 commercial providers have actually helped collaborate and really make that broad curriculum offer broadcast a fantastic support for parents and schools. So I think that's where it can work very well. And I think during a crisis, during school closures, absolutely. But it's moving it on from, if you're actually impacting on a very healthy competitive market already, any funding that goes into the system, really, really strongly recommend that it's put out there on a competitive commercial playing field, so that actually that can drive down costs for government in terms of having commercial providers and charitable whoever actually going out there and making sure that you can compete for to provide curriculum provisions. Really important. And I think then it moves on to that point that if you do have state subsidies that do distort and change a market, you've got thousands of schools out there who are working really, really happily and successfully with publishers and digital providers. if those digital providers are forced, it's a very, very tough market out there, so potentially putting at risk some of those ongoing services that thousands of schools are relying and happy with. And now if a school is offered, given the current really challenging financial situation, with a free resource here that they might not be entirely happy with, or it might not quite fit their rich and broad curriculum, but it's free, are we going to see a driving down to sort of a single lowest common factor, rather than that really healthy, rich breadth of curriculum and resources that are out there at the moment? And that's what worries me the most. I think teachers should have the right to choose, and we can't drive them to choices just on the basis of something has been paid for by somebody else, so it's out there, and other products haven't. I think it should be a commercially level playing field for all publishers.
And I think then it leads to the unintended consequences of having an impoverished offer, and it also reduces the kind of reach that, the reputation that the UK has internationally, for example, with its educational resources. We are widely seen as flagship country for the development of education and the educational resources we have. So clearly, in the long term, the unintended consequence of distorting the market and potentially losing some of the sort of competitors who are out there offering choice will also impact on our ability to export effectively, which we know, looking in the years ahead, is such an important source of revenue for both publishers and the government.
And looking forward, as we come out of this, do you think as publishers that you will be changing the way that you do publish? So much more digital, for example, using different business models. And there's a question that came up on the chat earlier that I want to throw in at this point as well, about from a freelancer who've said that they understand that many educational publishers have put the development of projects on hold. Will those be starting up again? So Lee, I don't know if you want to kick off with that one.
I think it will definitely change the way we publish for teachers and learners. I think we need to evolve our models, our business models, in line with how schools want to use our resources, particularly digitally, while also protecting our own incomes and our authors' incomes. So we need to develop content quite rapidly for those emerging needs, but also, as we've said, balancing speed with quality assurance and quality testing. In terms of slowing down on projects, I'm definitely not seeing that in my end. We haven't really postponed any of our publishing, so I can't comment on that, I'm afraid.
And Amy, are you changing the way that you publish in any shape or form?
Generally speaking, we're moving much more to online. We're developing training and learning resources for teachers and other professionals online, and as everyone else is. I'd say the other thing that JKP does possibly, that sets us out differently from the other publishers here, is we are very much committed to the social justice agenda. So one of the things that we're responding to is the kind of shift in thinking and this awareness about disadvantaged groups and marginalized groups. So we'll be doing more, I hope, on issues like racism and representation of BAME kids for children following the Black Lives Matter stuff. We'll be doing even more on transgender and stuff like that for kids, as well as our other diversity enterprises, because I think it's a really good time to support children across the board. So I suppose that's one of the changes, that is something we've always done, and we've always tried to be ahead of that, trying to empower marginalised and disadvantaged groups. But yes, we'll also be doing the online hybrid thing and working out what teachers need, and working with all the other educational publishers to do so.
Jane, will OUP be changing any of the way it publishes?
I mean, I think I completely agree with Lee that I think every publisher will be looking at its digital offer, at how we can enhance the teacher experience, particularly when they're having to do the sort of hybrid teaching and learning, how best to kind of involve parents in all of that. At the same point, we strongly believe in the blended offer. I think that physical resources, there's so much talk about digital, and actually we shouldn't lose sight of the value of physical resources in certain areas. Both for those disadvantaged children who don't necessarily have access to digital or data. It's essential that there is a sort of physical alternative. And also, in early reading, being able to handle books, share books, For children in secondary, having a textbook that they can actually take home with them, having revision guides. I don't see us moving away from print. I think over the next year or two, there are the challenges of how you manage print, particularly with issues of quarantining and, just actually, again, it goes back to the funding issue. I think schools will need to purchase more print in order to be able to manage things better. And so again, actually, children having access to that is incredibly important. I think also just looking at kind of partnership opportunities and working closely with other organisations where collectively we can bring things together to make people's lives easier. I mean, actually, we also have our sort of a mission as part of the University of Oxford. So our mission is about making a real difference to children's life chances, and actually an area of real interest for us and real focus is on the attainment gap, particularly in words and language, and the language gap. And that's an area that we're continuing to monitor really, really closely, and we'll be looking at the resources that we can produce that really support that. So those are some of the areas we're looking at.
Great. And Caroline, what impact do you think COVID will have on school funding moving forward? I know you touched a bit on some of the schemes earlier, and what do you think that this means for publisher resources?
I think, I'm sorry, we're coming to the end and I'm being miserable. That's not good. It's nice to end on a kind of a high point.
We are going to end on a positive note.
Good. All right, I can be miserable now. I do think it is worrying. The pressures on school budgets is incredible, and that was before COVID, and it's not got any better. And yes, we have seen some funding coming in, but as I've just outlined, it's a drop in the ocean. So I do think there are going to be really, really challenging times ahead for publishers, particularly as they've already been trying to help and support during the school closure period. So it is a worrying time, and I do think more funding and more support is needed for schools so that they can fund resources, because resources we see, at the best of times, it's only around 3% of a school budget which is spent on the entirety of curriculum resources. Yeah. The rest of it goes into, a big melting pot of other essential expenditure, the cost of teachers and so on and so on and so on. And that just means that it's something that if you've got a choice between, renewing some really dog-eared books and which really need renewing, or you'll try and make them last for another year, and it just carries on each year. The funding doesn't get better, so they try and make do and mend for another year. And I think it just comes to a point where, if anything we've seen, I think there is the need for digital, but there is the need for blended and physical resources too. Children with all the connectivity in the world, there's nothing like being able to have a textbook or a physical resource to sit down on when the Wi-Fi goes down. I'm surprised it hasn't gone down, so I've got children doing live lessons and other people doing conference calls. Having something that you can use offline is really important. And it's also something that if you've got it there, whether or not we see, like in Leicester, we go into another period of school closure or so on, you've got it, and the teachers can say, right, okay, today we're going to be focusing on X. So wherever you are, you can use it. So I think the investment in resources is really, really vital.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things I was thinking of is a lot more spending is going to have to go on things like school cleaning and maybe even more staff if the classrooms are being split, for example. So there's a huge amount of extra necessary spend that's going to have to come into the mix, and yet schools aren't necessarily being compensated and provided for funding to accommodate those extra costs. Jane, do you have anything you'd like to say on that subject?
No, I mean, I would agree with Caroline completely. I think schools' budgets have been stretched even more. They're going to be paid back ostensibly for some of the cleaning or some of the free school meal money, but actually that hasn't yet happened, and some schools have now discovered it won't happen. So those budgets are being stretched, and there is now promise of money for buildings. But again, you only have to watch the news and see the state of repair of some of the buildings and multiply that by the number of schools. Money is not going to go far. So again, the building budget is second to staff, the key area that goes from school funds. So I think funding is an ongoing issue, and it is incredibly important, and actually free can be a useful supplement, but it is not a substitute for the investment and value you actually get from good quality educational resources. I think there was a Frontier report that highlighted just how little actually, if you count in all the value you get from an educational resource. Emma, you'll probably remember this better than me. The investment, you get so much more out of it.
It pays for itself time
and time again. It pays for itself time and again, absolutely. So I think, you know, if anyone from the government is listening, more money to schools, please.
Amy, would you like to add anything to that point?
I think I just agree with what has been said. It's going to be a tough time to sort of reach teachers, but they will need our resources and our thoughtful collective publishing decisions about what we can provide them with.
And hopefully where they've had them all for free, there will be goodwill and that impetus to pay for them moving forward now they've realised how valuable they can be. Well, I said we'd finish on a positive note, so I want you to get your crystal balls out and let me know what your predictions and hopes are for the coming year for educational publishing, what you're looking forward to and what your priorities would be. So gather up some of that positive energy and think about what's exciting for the year ahead. Let's start with you, Lee.
Well, I think in terms of our hopes, I suppose, it's obviously that the virus stays in abeyance and that from September schools have a really clear run at reconnecting with students and their families and re-engaging them with learning. So our priorities are just to support them in that and remaining alert to the ways that we can support them and any way we can to free their time up to focus on students. And as I said before, I hope that they've given space and time to rebuild with as many of the external pressures as possible minimised. So that would be our kind of priorities. I don't know if I can quite get to predictions.
Is there anything that you're looking forward to in terms of what the year ahead might hold?
I think it's just it really is about everybody being back together, and I think that's in schools when we go into schools, being able to actually go into schools and speak to teachers and connect with schools again, being back in our offices. I think it's just that human need to congregate again is really overdue.
Jane?
I think what we've seen is the importance of education, and I think looking forward, I know obviously the health service, education are both critical. So I hope that going forward there will be ongoing investment into education, ongoing focus on actually helping children catch up. I think teachers hopefully will be better valued for the role they play. And actually there are some really encouraging statistics around teacher recruitment, with many more people registering an interest in going into teaching. I think being that key worker, I think that's been really positive. And I think the role of parental engagement has also been recognised. And so actually that I hope, and I think it's a really positive thing, that teachers can harness that engagement from many parents and really be able to build on it. And parents in turn will respect more what teachers do. And I think in terms of publishing, I hope people will see the genuine source of support, that we have been a real source of support and want to work with teachers, for teachers, and that actually our resources make a genuine impact in school and at home.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of our priority, it's to carry on working closely with schools and help them through the next few years, move beyond life after the pandemic, and really continue to support teachers with the resources that will make a real difference.
Great. And Amy, what's in your crystal ball and what are you looking forward to in the year ahead?
I suppose echoing again what the others said, but also specifically within our areas of SEN and neurodiversity, I do feel that COVID, as well as being a challenge, is an opportunity for us to be more focused on the child and the learner, whether it's the parent or the teacher who's providing the learning, to be more tailored to their needs and to support them to become empowered and advocate for themselves and their differences, and to feel stronger in themselves. I think COVID has helped us to maybe understand difference a bit more, but also be more connected and together, because we've all gone through this. And I hope that alongside our neurodiversity publishing, to support sort of more traditional learning and to inspire kids, we will also just be doing much more in the realm of our kids' books and really understanding what children themselves want to read about, how they can improve themselves and empower themselves and learn about the world they're in. I think this has made children, for good or ill, very aware that the world is something that they do need to be aware of, and that can change at the slightest notice.
And that kids actually look forward to going to school again.
Yeah, no, there is. Yeah, exactly. So that's a real opportunity in itself.
And let's finish with you, Caroline. Final source of optimism.
Yeah, well, I think I very much agree with Jane about parents and respecting education and the role of teachers, definitely. I think for me, sort of the optimism is we have seen schools and teachers really engaging with publishers and getting the most out of resources. I think some of the sources of frustration for education providers is their tools and offerings are so wide and so sophisticated, and sometimes because of pressures of times in schools, you know, a school might just use a tiny aspect of a product or a service. I think we've seen much more close collaboration between publishers and schools getting the most out of what's out there, which is pleasing for everyone. And I suppose on a personal note, to finish, I've really enjoyed, you know, given I know lots and lots of publishers and lots of digital providers, I've actually really enjoyed with my kids actually experiencing some of them. And I think that's food for optimism, because there are some amazing resources out there, and I've certainly learned a lot more than in those long ago days when I was at school. So I'm enjoying it as much as everyone, but looking forward to when they go back as well.
Great. Well done to all of you for all you're doing to support teachers and learners in this time. And I hope that our optimism shines through for next year and that you have a great year ahead. Thank you, Caroline, for everything you're doing to support publishers. And congratulations again to Amy and JKP on winning the Nibby. That's a nice note to end on. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you panelists for joining. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.